Because of Latin, right? Yeah, everyone knows the reason why the Romance languages are so similar is because they all broke off from Latin. Okay, but English, German, and Swedish all descend from Proto-Germanic, but they're way harder for each other's speakers to understand. Turns out, wind back the clock, and you find even more different languages in the wider Italic family, but they all went extinct after the Romans took over the entire peninsula. So, what were Latin's ancient cousins like? How did Latin diverge into the Romance languages we see today? And what happened to Latin itself after everyone started speaking its Romance descendants? In the early days, when Rome was just an itty-bitty little city-state, Latin was only really spoken in this area in central Italy, in the region of Lazio, nowadays italicized into Lazio. The rest of the peninsula, meanwhile, was dominated by Latin's long-lost relatives in the rest of the Italic family, such as the closely related Feliscan. But throughout inland Italy, most people at this time would have spoken one of the Osco-Umbrian languages, such as Oscan and Umbrian, but also including Volscian, Sabine, and South Piscine. Not North Piscine though, we don't talk about North Piscine. At the very northern and southern ends of modern Italy, meanwhile, there were also the Venetic and Siculian languages of Veneto and Sicily, which were definitely Indo-European, but there were still a few doubts on whether or not they can be counted as Italic. Records are very scarce from these times. Also, not to be confused with modern Venetian and Sicilian, but we'll get to that later. The real masters of the Italian peninsula during the Iron Age, however, were the Greeks in the south and the Etruscans in the north, whose languages were, of course, not Italic. In fact, Etruscan wasn't even Indo-European. Greek is particularly relevant here, though, because it was through them that the inhabitants of Italy got this thing called writing, as colonists from Evia brought their version of the Greek alphabet with them to their colonies, where the idea of writing would spread among the Italic peoples, evolving into the Old Italic script, which eventually evolved into the Latin alphabet. All these other Italic languages, as well as Etruscan, would all go extinct by the 1st century BC, at which point the entire peninsula, and a lot of other territories, belonged firmly to Rome. We actually have a good amount of records from some of these languages. Oscan, for instance, the language of the Samnites, has records like the Tabula Bantina from around 89 BC, and you can really see how similar it was to Latin, whilst also clearly being its own thing. This was also around the time of the Social War. As Rome expanded throughout the peninsula in previous centuries, some of these other Italic peoples were not conquered and absorbed into Rome outright, but were able to keep some autonomy, such as local governments minting their own coins and keeping their own languages in exchange for loyalty, usually in the form of military service, but this meant that they were not given Roman citizenship. So all the military service with none of the civil or political rights, which was dangerous when they made up 2/3 of the Roman army. This erupted in a 4-year-long civil war between Rome and the Socii, or allies, of Italia, which ended in a victory for the Republic, but a Pyrrhic one. No, not you, Pyrrhus of Epirus. Which contributed to the instability that led to the fall of the Republic and the rise of the Empire. By the way, if you're enjoying this video, be sure to drop a sub. Skipping over a few centuries, of course, with an empire this large, also came many different accents and dialects of Latin. This is where you might hear many today bring up the term Vulgar Latin, which many linguists are hesitant to use. It should not imply that the patricians and the plebeians spoke different dialects of Latin, more that there were a few minor differences in how the classes spoke. It was a difference that would have made some interactions inappropriate, like using Gen Alpha internet slang whilst addressing the United Nations, but you would have generally been understood. So basically, if you're going to use the term, use it in the same way you'd say something like casual English. But I'm also not saying Vulgar Latin is a completely useless term, as there were many different registers and accents that formed across the massive empire, recorded by Roman authors as the Sermo Vulgaris, or the common speech. This usually came in the form of people dropping their H's, pronouncing vowels a little differently, or bringing in loanwords from other languages, such as the languages of the peoples the Romans conquered. The Roman Republic and later Empire was a unifying institution that was able to enforce one Latin language. until it wasn't. As I've mentioned in a couple previous videos, however, Latin didn't actually catch on in the eastern half of the empire, past a boundary known as the Jurachek line, where Greek remained the lingua franca, or I guess the koine glossa. This is why in 620, the surviving eastern half of the Roman Empire switched to using Greek as its official language, while Latin remained in the Western Roman. Oh right, it doesn't exist anymore. Without a singular authority in the West, Latin was free to diverge into different dialects. Naturally, it was the common vernacular that began to split off, forming a western branch in Gaul and Hispania, which may or may not also include the Italo-Dalmatian branch in Italy and Croatia, a short-lived Pannonian branch in Hungary, an eastern branch in the Balkans, which would eventually give us Romanian, a southern or island branch, which would give us what many consider to be the most conservative of the Romance languages, Sardinian, and the extinct African Romance language of Northern Africa, known of course to the Romans as Africa. Of course, the line between speaking Latin with a funny accent and speaking a completely new language descended from Latin is a very blurry line, with each generation speaking just a little differently, adopting new words, pronouncing things a little differently, the kinds of things that normally add up to speaking a different language after enough generations. Also worth keeping in mind is that the fall of the Western Roman Empire didn't just break apart the once unified political entity, but also motivated many people in the cities to gradually resettle in the countryside, isolating different groups even further. The earliest records we have today of these new Romance languages as a thing separate from Latin mostly come from the 8th and 9th centuries, such as the Oaths of Strasbourg. This was a peace treaty signed in 842 between Charles the Bald of the West Franks, whose armies would have spoken Old French, and Louis the Pious of the East Franks, whose armies would have spoken Old German. I mean, they wouldn't have called these dialects old at the time, but you get what I'm saying. If you're curious about what Old French looked like, by the way, here's a snippet of what Charles's French soldiers would have sworn. You can see that it's not that different from Latin, but you can also see some primordial French beginning to form. It was also around this time that Western Romance broke off into Gallo-Romance and Ibero-Romance, which is not that easy to pronounce. Most of the Iberian Peninsula had been taken over by the kingdom of the Visigoths, who spoke a Germanic language known as Gothic, though this was mostly among the elites, with little impact among the people living in the kingdom, except for a few loanwords in modern Spanish at least. Either way, they wouldn't stay for long, as the early 8th century saw the Umayyad Caliphate take over most of the peninsula. Under Arab rule, logically, Arabic became the main language of government, religion, and literature, which is why Spanish has so many Arabic loanwords. But the local Romance dialect still remained in use under Umayyad rule, giving us Mozarabic, or Andalusi Romance. Ever wanted to see what a Romance language looks like when written in Arabic or Hebrew? Interesting request, but now you have your answer. In fact, the same is also true with Ladino, or Judeo-Spanish, which comes from Castilian, but also adds in some Hebrew words and grammar rules and is written in Hebrew. Kind of like Yiddish, except from a different part of the Jewish diaspora. The Umayyads never took over this strip along the northern coast though, and it was here where the other dialects would break off from each other, forming what would become Portuguese, Catalan, Galician, Astroleonese, and Castilian over the course of the Reconquista. Catalan, however, is actually considered a Gallo-Romance language, very similar to Occitan, though one that of course would have absorbed many features from its Ibero-Romance neighbors over the centuries, as most languages do. Romansh, by the way, is Gallo-Romance, just to not forget about them. This is similar to what happened in Italy, where Venetian, Sicilian, Neapolitan, Romagnola, and all the others are not dialects of Italian, they're separate languages that evolved very closely alongside Italian, or should I say Tuscan, which would become the standardized dialect to be used across Italy when they unified in the 1860s. The languages of Italy are also often combined with the Dalmatian language, which went extinct in 1898 when its last confirmed speaker was killed in an explosion. Yes, that actually happened. I've mentioned Sardinian as a South Romance language, also known as Island Romance. I'll explain what makes the language conservative in a couple minutes, but note that there are actually multiple varieties of Sardinian spoken on the island, such as Locudoris, Nuaris, and Campidanse, with Sassarese in the north actually being more closely related to the Italo-Dalmatian languages, like Corsican. And lastly, the Eastern Romance branch in the Balkans gives us Romanian and Aromanian, also sometimes called Vlach if you don't want to confuse the two. Moldovan is also here, but it's a dialect of Romanian. These languages would have sat right in the middle of the Balkan Sprachbund, taking influence from Albanian, Greek, Turkish, and the various Slavic languages all around them. What really separates Latin from languages like Proto-Germanic is that while its dialects were splitting apart into different languages, Latin was still being spoken. Kind of. Latin was long dead by this time, at least as anyone's native language, but as one of the only intercultural common tongues Europe had ever had up until now, and with tons of surviving works from the Roman days, the language remained a useful tool in politics, science, and most of all, religion, which at this time was kind of the same as the first two. Thus, as the Catholic Church increasingly cemented its position as the new unifying authority over Europe, so too did Latin remain in use by the elites of the continent, as in the people who would have been reading and writing, traveling, getting educations, and having access to said Roma documents. But even after the fall of Rome, not everyone spoke Latin the same way, and in fact, to this day, there are some minor differences between what we call classical Latin and ecclesiastical or church Latin. Things like C's being pronounced ch before E's or I's, or certain U's being pronounced as V's, or H's being dropped just in general. This is part of why people say Sardinian is a conservative language, since in Sardinian the letter C on its own always makes a k sound, like in the word for sky, which is caelum in Latin, cielo in Italian, cielo in Spanish, and celu in Sardinian. The thing is, though, many people would have already been pronouncing Latin in the ecclesiastical way as early as the 5th century, while Classical Latin refers to how the language was spoken from the 1st century BC to the 1st or 2nd centuries AD. We actually know how Latin was pronounced back then because several writers got frustrated with how people were mispronouncing certain words and wrote down their thoughts detailing how words should be pronounced. So, in other words, we know how Classical Latin was meant to be pronounced because even ancient Rome had people fetching about people's grammar, which I honestly just find funny. I sort of went into this video wondering if the Romance languages can be considered a dialect continuum. You know, where persons A and B speak a little differently but can still understand each other, same with B and C and D, but A and D cannot understand each other. I mean, I've studied Spanish and Italian, and I can sort of understand the other Romance languages when I see them, so I don't think it's a bad question to ask. Turns out that isn't the case, at least not with the entire family, since there are just too many gaps in certain areas. But sometimes it is the case when you look region by region, such as across Italy. Regarding why the Romance languages are so similar to each other, especially compared to other branches, it helps that Latin was spoken more recently than Proto-Germanic or Proto-Slavic or especially Proto-Semitic. But basically everything about Rome and its legacy steered everything to what we see today, not only in making people want to keep speaking the old tongue more than 1,000 years after the western half of the empire fell, and occasionally wanting to make their local dialect more like Latin, but also in forging cultural links across Europe and the Mediterranean. I suppose it's not the most revolutionary answer to this question, but hey, at least I got to cover some interesting history in there too.